to talk about the inner critic and how it relates with our well-being and our recovery. And I know that for myself, I can certainly feel self-critical about how I'm handling these kinds of important questions. Easy to get down on myself that I'm not doing enough, or I'm not doing it right, or I'm not being a good enough ally. I think maybe I should have called this workshop session the inner critic versus self-compassion, because sometimes it feels like a real fight to the end with those two. This topic is personal to me. I have that voice in my head that says, I'm too old, I'm too fat, I'm too late. Like, that's one I hear so often in recovery, right? I'm too late to turn my life around, experience radiant health, and become a productive member of society. All of these things were not. I've had the opportunity to work with those voices for a long time, because these stories in our heads hold us back from making the changes that we want to make, so that we can dive into our recovery full-heartedly and enjoy a happy, healthy, high-energy life in recovery. So I've been there, and I've learned a few tricks, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Talking about the inner critic and self-compassion, and how we can work with these two to move toward the abundant, radiant health that is possible in these rooms. So I'm Lulu Cook. I'm a counselor, dietitian. I teach meditation locally here and at a prison in my area, author of a best-selling book on the anti-inflammatory diet. And I've been in the rooms, I've been in recovery for 20 plus years, using a variety of different support fellowships to help me continue to recover and thrive and become, become, the best self I can be, the best expression of possibility in this world. Not there yet, but still working on it, and grateful for the rooms of recovery to make that possible. In this nutrition and wellness weekly session, we talk about actionable skills and strategies. We talk about the evidence about what works to help us feel better physically and emotionally. So it's evidence-based information that I offer, and then we open up for some Q&A or sharing at the end. And if you have general questions or topics to share, welcome to pop those perhaps into the chat box as we go along. And also welcome to email me, lulu@gutfeelingcoaching.com, and you can get my follow me on Facebook. I announce the topics for the week to come at Gut Feeling Nutrition Therapy, or on my website, Gut Feeling Nutrition Therapy. So those are all ways to get in touch, get more information, and stay tuned to what's coming for next week. Whilst we're here on the call, want to invite people to use their chat box. That's the little down at the bottom of your screen, probably with a green leaf. You can chat in questions or comments as we go. I do try to pick those up a little bit as we go along. And then again, there will be more time at the end for everyone to chime in. I do try to record the information that I offer. Obviously not you guys speaking for anonymity reasons, but the information I offer, I do try to record. I post those on my Facebook or YouTube, Gut Feeling Nutrition Therapy, when I'm able to get a clean recording, which isn't every time, but we are so close to reaching technical perfection with these calls. So maybe this will be the day that we get there. We're going to define inner critic and talk about the biology of it. It actually turns out that this is based in our physical structures. Our physical health is where this inner critic character lives. So we're going to talk about that and where it comes from. How does recovery relate with the inner critic? It 100% does. As I was doing some research for this, I found out there is a book out there on the perfection detox. So, promising that we could actually become abstinent. We could put down perfectionism and the inner critic and detox from it. We're going to dive into the differences between guilt and shame, the differences between self-esteem and self-compassion, and how our body and physical health relate to all this and can be guides for what's really going on. And just a reminder always that you are the expert on you. So there'll be quite a few different ideas coming out in this talk, perhaps in what people share later. Lots of different ways we can work with this inner critical voice. You are the expert on you, and happily, because we're all gathered here in this context, we also have access to the wisdom and experience of others in recovery. So what is the inner critic? Well, maybe it's like what the Supreme Court said about pornography, that it's a little hard to define, but we know it when we see it, or we know it when we hear it, right? We couldn't find an inner critic, like an actual person somewhere necessarily. It's that inner voice, a deep feeling of personal deficiency, that inner drive, I have to be perfect. Perfectionism and the inner critic are tightly intertwined in the research. Strict, negative, critical inner voice or inner thoughts about ourselves. The research literature talks about it as negative self-evaluation and some of these kinds of more formal terms, but we know it just in our lives and our experience. We typically know it as the inner critic, or that judgmental voice that's always telling us we have to do better, we did it wrong, we failed, we are failures, we will fail, all of this, yeah? I'm hopeful I'm not the only one who knows that voice and that I'm in good company here today. Something so important that we're going to look at is that this voice is based out of protection. It originated in order to try to keep us emotionally and physically and psychologically safe, and it's just not adaptive anymore. Kind of got too big for its britches, and it's time to bring it back down to a size so instead of causing harm, it could start to actually really help us instead. So let's go. Oh, I'm breaking up on my mic. I'm not sure what to do about that. I have full bars and hope everyone can hear me. So we'll just have to carry on and hope for the best, I think. So where does this inner critic come from? Well, it is really the voice of our early caregivers. It is an internalized voice of authority over us. There's a quote from the cartoonist Jules Feiffer. He said, I grew up to have my father's looks, my father's speech patterns, my father's posture, my father's walk, my father's opinions, and my mother's contempt for my father. So I have that internalized voice from my parents, living out so much of what I learned from them, including that self-hatred. It could also be the voice of current people in our life that we hear echoed in our own thoughts that seem so true. I'll give you an example. I had dental surgery last week, and I had a plan. I got the dentist on board. My plan was I was just going to eat ice cream for a couple days because my tooth hurt. And I had said that to my partner. All I want is ice cream. Let's stop and buy some ice cream because my mouth hurts. And in fact, mostly I ate ice cream for a couple of days. A little bit of yogurt too. And at one point she made a comment about, oh, you really went through that ice cream pretty fast. And don't you know, despite the fact that I planned to eat nothing but ice cream, I told her I was eating nothing but ice cream, I did eat almost nothing but ice cream, that little comment from her lodged in my head, and I felt pretty obsessive about it. Did I eat too much ice cream? I should have had a better recovery plan from my tooth surgery. I should have had soup instead of ice cream. All of these shoulds, right? So that offhand comment from my partner today just landed smack into my experience of self-criticism and amplified it. So there's a neural basis for this. There's a physical basis of these voices we hear, these thoughts and words we hear, judging and measuring us, measuring ourselves all the time. Those neural systems are attempting to identify and manage danger in our surroundings. They become super sensitized for some of us as children, particularly if, as young people, we did not experience a secure, stable caregiving environment. We may have experienced various kinds of trauma, whether major trauma or just insidious daily lack of attunement and care from our caregivers. These early wounds create a neural system that is always on alert, always scanning environments and relationships, looking for danger. And we know that those of us who have a highly active internal critic will be at higher risk for depression, disordered eating, obsessive compulsive disorder. This is all very clear in the research, and there's starting to be more research looking at how those early experiences and that critical inner voice, how do they interact with addictions, alcohol, gambling, sex, drugs? Starting to see some research on that as well. And we see, looking at all of these domains, that inner critic is a source of self-blame and problematic coping strategies as an adult, but it was born in the pain and traumas of our childhood. So here's what happens. Here's what the cycle is that the research points to here. And the research does show that this inner critic voice is more highly active in people with addiction histories or trauma histories. We develop this controlling style toward ourselves, toward others, to try to stay safe. And because of those wounds, because of those traumas, as adults, this system in our brain is constantly, continuously scanning and reviewing for danger. And then that gets interpreted into the voices of self-criticism that we hear. It's essentially an attempt to maintain a protective space and protective zone, and to be able to plan ahead for any potential risk to our physical and emotional well-being. When we have that more highly sensitive danger system, always scanning, when that's in place, and then something happens that is difficult, something that puts us under a sense of duress, something that is challenging, then we get more emotional reactivity than we might prefer to have, yeah? We lean heavy into our dysfunctional emotional regulation tactics. Those can typically include what's called dissociation, where we just kind of check out and numb out and tune out. One of the ways many of us might do that is through substances or behaviors of addiction, drinking ourselves numb or eating ourselves numb. We dissociate, or perhaps we do what the research calls ruminate. We just chew over it again and again and again. If I felt concerned about my status at work for some reason, any little trigger that lands into my sensitive danger scanning threat will leave me chewing over it again and again and again. What did my boss say? What were the exact words? What were their tone? What did it mean? They hate me. They think I'm doing a terrible job. They're going to fire me. That rumination and thought, chewing over that same thought again and again happens, and then perhaps hand in hand with that desire to numb out. So I'm going to have a drink while I continue to cogitate on what went wrong. And this is just so natural and normal. It's just our animal system trying to keep us safe in a maladaptive way, a dysfunctional way. So the addictions that we pick up in those times when we're feeling triggered or under duress, the addictive behaviors or substances, they help resolve our discomfort in the moment. They temporarily alleviate our concerns. They work. If I'm having that sense of concern and worry over my work and I'm feeling uncomfortable about it, I'm feeling scared and vulnerable, well, guess what? Picking up a cupcake, picking up a drink, or checking out to go gambling, any of those will help me feel better in the moment. However, the more often we give into that, our inner critic actually gets to become stronger and berate us and beat us up for giving in to these less healthy coping strategies. So this quality that's meant to protect us morphs into a tyrant who's shaming us internally. And all of this catalyzes shame. So we find that alcohol and other drugs help us self-medicate that inner experience of shame that has its voice as the inner critic. This happens, again, the neurobiology is there. It's not that there's something wrong with us. It's that there really is something happening physiologically. So, for example, the neurotransmitter GABA inhibits reactivity in the brain, and it's tightly linked with addiction. For instance, alcohol disrupts the GABA pathway. It lowers our inhibitions. So alcohol lowers our inhibitions, and prior to coming into recovery, we might have found that we were relying on alcohol to feel good. We relied on the alcohol to disinhibit us, to loosen us up so we could engage in social activities and have pleasure. What does the research show that we're self-medicating? Shame. We cannot talk about the inner critic without talking about shame. And I hate that. Wouldn't do it to you if I didn't have to, because shame is this dark, sticky, swampy feeling place inside that who wants to go there? We spend a lot of energy and a lot of time trying to tap dance around that swamp. And yet we see that the most common coping mechanisms that we turn to in diversity or in adversity are two different coping mechanisms. One is shame. This is a very old, deeply wired response, as we have explored a little bit of. The other one we turn toward is self-esteem boosting activities, positive affirmations, telling ourselves we can do better, lots of trying to build up our self-esteem because we made a mistake. We're shaming ourselves for our shortcomings, and we're thinking that that will motivate us to change. If the shame doesn't motivate us to change, perhaps our positive affirmations and our self-esteem building of looking ourselves in the mirror and saying, gosh darn it, you're good enough and people like you. Have you ever done that? I have. I don't think it hurt anything, but here's the deal. The research shows neither of these work. It might not hurt anything to give ourselves those affirmations, but it doesn't fundamentally transform this relationship of depression and addiction and shame. It's not fundamentally transformed by positive affirmations, and it's certainly not transformed by falling into that same critical shame loop that is just a physiological expression of our autonomic nervous system. Let's differentiate shame and guilt for a moment. Shame is the perception that we are flawed. Our self is flawed and wrong in the eyes of others and in our own eyes. Guilt is the idea that we might have done wrong. We engaged in a negative action that caused harm, and we're aware of that. If we weren't aware of it and didn't care, we'd be sociopathic, right? Guilt is viewed as a pro-social emotion. It helps us be able to reflect on our wrongdoings and choose different behaviors going forward. There's research showing that people who are not addicts or alcoholics who engage in excessive drinking at a social occasion, this will predict lower levels of drinking after the fact because they have that guilt, that healthy social awareness of not wanting to cause harm. That doesn't work on those of us who have hardcore addiction and alcoholism histories. Part of the reason why is because we get mired more so in the shame side of it. This something's wrong with me and I need to avoid facing that. Shame, high shame scores predict high risk drinking. Guilt does not. It predicts higher levels of depression and anxiety. Guilt does not. Essentially, what we see is the difference being that shame tells us I am wrong or bad. Guilt tells us I did something wrong. I did something bad. And so we have these powerful tools. Those of us who are engaged in certainly 12-step recovery paradigms, but some of the other ones as well, refuge recovery, some of these recovery programs we can engage with that encourage us to take that searching and fearless look at our behavior and then make amends for it. These are signs of a healthy pro-social guilt response, whereas defaulting to shame as expressed by the inner critic keeps us trapped in addiction. And so looking a bit more at what's going on at the physiological level, the brain level, when our shame gets activated, we feel like we made a mistake. Somebody says something to us that typically might remind us of, early caregiver comments. We feel at risk and vulnerable. Something happens. Our shame response gets triggered, and that moves us into a fight, flight, or freeze brain pattern. Our responses become incredibly rigid and tight and constricted. They're not flowing. The amygdala, this ancient part of the brain back here, when we're feeling that wave of shame, you know what that wave feels like, right? Oh, hot, red, sick to my stomach. Yours might be a little bit different, but those are really common shame responses. Our amygdala gets triggered, this old part of our brain. It releases stress hormones of cortisol, norepinephrine. And what those hormones do is they block our capacity to make clear decisions, form new memories. Our emotional responses are affected. Stress level increases. Our perspective gets narrowed to only the perceived threat. So in the example I gave earlier with, maybe if I was worried I was going to lose my job, we can become so obsessive about that. We're not even at work. It's the weekend, and it's all we're thinking about. Our perceptions get narrowed to the perceived threat, and our ability to learn is inhibited. We lose our ability to learn something new when we're in that triggered, stressful, shameful response, that inner critic response. And a funny thing is we might be able to talk about all of our, quote, flaws, but we can't change them. This is part of the inner critic, right? We're telling ourselves this stuff. I'm too old. I got sober too late. I'm never going to be a success. We might be able to, we certainly hear it inside. We can say it out loud to somebody we're sitting with, but that doesn't help change it. Just seeing that negative spew doesn't help us change what's happening. So it's more likely actually to lead to a self-sabotage of our goals. And that's what the research shows. There's three main messages that the inner critic will give us. There's going to be should messages. You should be over your cravings for your drug of choice by now. You've been out of treatment for a couple of years. There's disparaging statements that put us down, like you really messed your life up while you were using, you're just a loser. And then there's negative predictions. You messed up so bad whilst you were drinking, you're never going to get your life together again. You're never going to be able to stay abstinent. You have let your health go so bad. Your diet is so terrible. You're never going to fix it. You're never going to get healthy again with all the damage you've done. So those are the three kinds of messages that are most likely to come in. It's the should messages, the disparaging or judgmental messages, and it's the negative predictions about the future. All of this stirs up. Do we feel good in the face of all this? Heavens no. Yeah? We feel defective, shameful, inferior, anxious, depressed, self-blaming. None of that creates a sense of motivation and capacity to continue making positive changes in our lives. In fact, when we are believing those self-critical messages, we're putting ourselves into an almost constant toxic emotional state, negative emotional state. And this is one of the primary situations that is responsible for up to 75% of drug and alcohol relapse, is being in that kind of a negative emotional state. So there's real world consequences on our health behaviors from letting that inner critic run amok. We see that looking at a study of almost 500 adults, they were looking to see what are the primary motivators or triggers for problem drinking. And it was internalized self-criticism and drinking as a means to cope with difficult emotions. Those were the qualities that predicted hazardous drinking in middle-aged adults. Self-criticism, drinking to cope with emotions. For younger people, it was comparative self-criticism. So not just the self-criticism about how much I suck, but the comparing of how much I suck compared to my peers. That was one of the primary instigators of problem drinking in young people. So we see that really direct impact on real world behaviors. And we could ripple that out to our other health behaviors as well, yeah? I'm pulling out the research preferentially around addiction. We're going to pick it up and look at food in a minute. I know many of us struggle with food addiction, and we'll see how this inner critic relates with food addiction. But first, let's talk about shame and relapse, the inner critic and relapse. People who have higher levels of shame expressed through that inner critic are at higher risk of alcohol misuse, higher risk of dropping out from treatment, and higher risk of more drinking after treatment, which of course just gives our inner critic something to go wild with. You went to treatment and you couldn't even do that right, and now you're drinking so much more. Yeah? Oh, it's like a field day for the inner critic when that happens. These high shame scores predict problem drinking and other addictive problems. So looking at the food example, dieting, what's happening when we're, quote, on a diet? Well, we're going to restrict our food for a while. We're reducing our calorie intake because we're hoping for a particular effect. We're hoping to lose weight. Maybe we just want to look a certain way. Maybe we hope that our health will be better if we lose that weight. Inevitably, we break the diet at some point. There is no diet in the world that never gets broken, ever. But when we have those high scores for shame and self-criticism, when we break that diet, we turn inward with just poison. We give up, we lose confidence. And then eating more food provides emotional numbing from this critical shame cascade we're experiencing. So the food helps us numb those uncomfortable emotions. We keep eating. Well, that binge is something to feel even worse about later. That is the cycle we get ourselves into. There was a great donut study of yo-yo dieters. This was done at Duke University. They took half of the study group were all dieters, people who were on a diet. So they split them in half. They invited everybody, asked everybody to eat a donut as part of the study. And half of them, they didn't give any more context to than that. They just said, please eat this donut. The other half, they said, please eat this donut. And you know, several people in this study have mentioned that eating the donut makes them feel really bad about themselves. And, you know, this is the study design, but I really hope you won't be too hard on yourself for eating the donut. Guess what happened? The people who were invited to be a little kinder to themselves about it reported less distress after eating the donut, more self-compassion. They didn't feel as bad. The people who were given no information, they were just left to their own thinking about the fact that they had eaten that donut. They were hard on themselves. They reported feeling guilty. They reported feeling ashamed. And besides those feelings, there was a later part of the study. The study participants were told later in the day, we're going to do a taste test of these different lollies, these different candies. We're doing a taste test. Have as many as you like. Well, the group that had been invited to practice some kindness toward themselves earlier for eating the donut, they voluntarily ate less candy later. Whereas the group that didn't have that context of self-compassion and were just stuck with their feelings of shame and guilt, they ate more candy later. It was self-compassion, not self-judgment, that helped people to stay focused on their healthy goals. So this is so important for our recovery, isn't it? We could see using our substances and using our behaviors to rebel against that inner critical voice, just shut it up, especially if it sounds like, our critical parents' voice or these really old, painful voices. Shut it up. We're rebelling against it using our substances of addiction. And yet the health of our mind and the health of our bodies are intrinsically connected together. And each of them affects and can either strengthen or weaken our likelihood of remaining clean and sober and loving our lives in recovery. Findings suggest that the ability to practice self-forgiveness, self-kindness, reduces the movement into addictive behaviors for people who start out with high levels of shame. So this sounds like a great idea. We want to change this identity. And a reminder, there's a researcher named Siegel. He calls that inner critic, he calls it the checker. So this is that voice. It's going to keep us safe from danger by scanning the environment just like other mammals do. It's going to alert us to danger. Biologically based system, hopefully there to motivate us to act, to escape real danger and threat. It is a deeply embedded and important part of our self-identity. And when we take it on really personally, we can even give that inner critic power in the sense of feeling like, no, I need to be hard on myself to be sure I keep doing the right thing. If I was too kind and soft to myself, I would probably just eat donuts and wash them down with beer all day, right? We can have that idea that there's something, we can intuitively sense the motivating capacity of this neural system. But again, it's that question of balance. Has it run amok? Who am I if I'm not self-critical? It feels like a risk to let that go. But those of us in recovery already have the experience of letting something go and creating new identities based around something that emphasizes recovery and resilience and something more nourishing for our experience. We can learn to cope effectively with the inner critic, use its protective capacity for the good, develop more effective emotional self-management techniques, and harness all of the power of that inner critic to be able to make the positive changes we want to make in our recovery. So when we do that, when we intentionally cultivate acceptance, self-forgiveness, self-compassion, it decreases our risk of relapse. It increases our risk of a successful longer-term recovery. And for those of us in 12-step programs, that's where we're focusing with our 4th, 5th, and 6th steps, right? Typically, relapse prevention, like formal relapse prevention programs, might focus on cognitive behavioral approaches, lifestyle approaches. The research shows us that no matter what the addiction is, so they've looked at alcohol, gambling, nicotine, heroin, no matter what the addiction is, there are 3 high-risk situations that are responsible for 75% of relapses. What are those high-risk zones? negative emotional states, interpersonal conflict, and social pressure. You might imagine how shame and remorse and self-critical behavior could play in with all of those. The negative emotional states, when we're just shaming ourselves all the time and criticizing ourselves all the time. Interpersonal conflict and social pressure, so much of that inner criticism will come out in regards to how we're managing relationships. And we see there's a misunderstanding. You might have heard this sometimes, possibly from your own mind, but also from other people in recovery, this misunderstanding that piling on the shame and the self-criticism might help us stay sober, right? Might help us remain abstinent from particular behaviors. The risk, of course, is that this is going to degenerate into a toxic self-blame that doesn't help. Do you know anyone who successfully stayed abstinent, clean, sober over the long run based out of nothing but guilt and shame? These are not positive motivators. This is not what sustains us and keeps us doing the hard yards of continuing to recover over time. And in fact, what the research shows is that self-blame reduces our sense of self-efficacy. It reduces our sense that we have the power to take positive action, and it impairs our self-esteem, ultimately leading to relapse. So maybe we need to repair our self-esteem to recover. Maybe not. Self-esteem actually requires us, the technical definition of self-esteem requires us to be proving our worth and demonstrating that we are valuable and worthy. It's a volatile, unstable sense of self when we're relying on this self-esteem measure. Self-compassion says we are always worthy no matter what. We feel compassion and kindness for ourselves because we are a person, not because we've done anything particularly right. Self-compassion, mindfulness, common humanity, these lead to a stable sense of self-worth. And it gives us a lot of resilience when something goes wrong, whether that's something from the outside or maybe we did make a mistake. We make mistakes, right? We want to be resilient and not be thrown off track by those mistakes. And that's why self-compassion is viewed in the research as one of the components of this quality called grit. Huh? Oh, I love it. Grit. I don't think we use that term often enough. So when we're cultivating self-compassion, there's been research done in alcohol treatment facilities, and they find that the people, this was a 15-week study, the people who rocked up for residential alcohol treatment had higher self-judgment, depression, anxiety, stress, isolation, and of course higher alcohol use than people in the general population. They were also lower in self-compassion. And after this 15-week intensive intervention to try to increase self-compassion, they found that scores for depression, anxiety, and alcohol use all decreased. So there was a reduction in alcohol use with an increase in self-compassion because they were able, for many of the participants, they were able to improve those self-compassion scores over time. So we really want to perhaps befriend this inner critic and bring a compassionate approach to our experience. Important to know that a uniform approach does not work. We are all the experts in us. We have different critical voices to contend with. And many of us will never get rid of that critical voice entirely, but we could befriend or harness it, make it work for us instead of controlling us, because it is there to serve that purpose. We just don't want to hear it with the harsh and dictatorial tone. So those of us who maybe have a milder version of the inner critic, you may be able to use suppression of that voice using the sort of stop thoughts technique to really nip it in the bud. So what that means is when we start to hear those self-critical thoughts, we could just literally say, I have a friend who just says it out loud. We might be talking or she might be making a cup of tea and she'll say, stop. And what she's doing is she's actually literally telling her self-critical voices, stop it. I don't want to hear from you right now. So we might really be able to do that. We don't have to believe those thoughts. We don't have to act on them. Yeah, we can defuse the power of those self-critical thoughts. One of the ways I get a kick out of, I like the idea of singing the self-criticism. So if my self-criticism is, I am a failure, we can try just singing that to ourselves to the happy birthday song or the jingle bell song. I am a failure, I am a failure, I'm a failure all the way. Do a few rounds of that. It is hard to keep taking the self-critical voice seriously. So those of us who have a mild voice of self-criticism may find that that works well. If we are really gripped by a much more stern, severe, intense self-criticism voice, just trying to nip it in the bud and suppress it doesn't seem to work so well. In that case, really accepting and befriending the inner critic looks like it works better for many people. Attuning to what that inner critic is trying to express and helping shift that in a more beneficial direction. So in general, what this would mean is starting again with that real foundation in self-compassion, which we don't have to believe in the moment. We don't actually have to believe that we're worthy of self-compassion. We just have to practice inclining our mind in that direction. And there's specific exercises we can use for that. So we start with self-compassion, self-forgiveness, and acceptance, or the intention for those. We move into real awareness, identifying what that critical voice of ours is, observing it. When does it get triggered? What is it trying to express? We have this sense of curiosity. Where does it come from? It can be helpful to connect the dots and to see where it originated. We can have this conversation with that critical voice to really dive below that. You suck. You're a failure. You're never going to be able to stay clean. You're never going to be able to. We can drop down below that and find out what is being protected here. What are you really trying to express? And we can negotiate with that voice. Hey, I appreciate the protection. Thank you so much. I need to move on and live my life now, so I'm going to ask you to take more of a back seat. But I see you as a nurturer, I see you as a protector, and you're welcome to continue in that protective and beneficial role with the limits that my adult conscious self is going to place here. We can look at somatic therapy and using the body as part of this healing process. We absolutely know that physical health, poor physical health can lead to poor mental health, depression, mood instability. Our food choices can provoke mood instability. And so changing things at the physical level can help create more space to work with that emotional or psychological level. And likewise, of course, as we become more balanced and healthy in terms of how we're thinking and how we're thinking about ourselves, we might feel more motivated to care for ourselves with a real sense of self-love and wanting to nourish ourselves. We see the positive psychology movement points to some of these connections, and encouragingly, the positive psychology research shows that this attitude of self-compassion and self-kindness can be learned. We can learn how to stop being so self-critical. And when we do that, we become more likely to take action to maintain a positive and healthy lifestyle. We are more engaged with social support that's nourishing, and our actual biological mechanisms are soothed. Our immune system, our digestive system, our stress circuitry, all of this is soothed and becomes healthier and better balanced. We have better heart rate variability, for heaven's sakes, less damaging blood clotting. Like this movement, this shift from being at the mercy of the inner critical voice to having a self-compassionate voice of self-care, as what we hear, is profound, profound. So my question to you right now is, do you struggle with an inner critic? When you are quiet, what comes to mind? What do you say to yourself when you make a mistake? What do you say to yourself when you make a mistake? Do you have a voice that is constantly reminding you of the rules, what you should do and shouldn't do, should feel and shouldn't feel? That is the inner critic. It may not be working in your favor if that's the predominant voice you hear. So right before opening it up for some questions or some sharing, I'm going to invite you to just a quick little self-compassion break. This is based on the work of Kristin Neff, a lead researcher in self-compassion. And we can use this, we'll do it right now. Hopefully nobody's feeling too triggered. The invitation with this self-compassion break is that we could use it anytime we are feeling overwhelmed by that shame and that critical voice. But we could just do it right now, imagining a time we're feeling that difficulty and asking or acknowledging to ourselves, this is a moment of suffering. You could even put your hands on your belly or your heart. This is a moment of suffering. Ouch. This is stressful. We remind ourselves, suffering is a part of living. I share this in common with everybody else on this call, everybody else in the rooms trying to recover. Everybody else out in the world not even trying to recover, maybe not needing recovery. I share this with everyone. Suffering is a part of living. May I be kind to myself. May I learn to be kind to myself. May I learn to give myself what I need. May I accept myself as I am. May I be kind to myself. May I learn to be kind to myself. So it can just be that short and sweet, to take that little self-compassion break. Let the inner critic quiet down over there and come back to a place of self-care that lets us put our recovery, our health, our well-being front and center. Thank you so much for being here today to dig into this topic. I feel so passionate about, so sure that it's part of our key to freedom. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say about it. So I'll tick over now and invite the speaker.